Good afternoon. I'm Nina Rovinelli Heller, the Dean of the Yukon School of Social Work, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our program today, The Naked Truth, Delivery by Death. This is the concluding program in our year-long series of Black History 365. We know that health disparities for Black women are staggering, long-lasting, and dangerous. None is more concerning than the one that begins at the moment of delivery and birth, increasing risks for both mother and child at a very critical moment. It is my pleasure to introduce our guest, Dr. Lucinda Canty, who will serve as our moderator today. She is a certified nurse midwife and assistant professor of nursing at the University of St. Joseph in West Hartford, Connecticut. She received her BSN from Columbia University and her MSN from Yale University, specializing in nurse midwifery, and her PhD from the University of Connecticut. The title of her dissertation was "It's Not Always Rainbows and Unicorns: The Lived Experience of Severe Maternal Morbidity Among Black Women." Her research interests go on to include the prevention of maternal mortality and severe maternal morbidity, reducing racial and ethnic health disparities in reproductive health, promoting diversity in nursing, and eliminating racism in nursing practice and profession. She is an artist. If all of this were not enough, she is also an artist, a poet, and a historian. She currently provides women's health care at Planned Parenthood of New England, and she currently hosts web discussions, Overdue Reckoning on Racism in Nursing. This initiative was launched in September 2020 to open discussion that focused on coming to terms with racism in nursing, a reckoning that acknowledges the reality and begins a process of healing and change. We are so delighted and thankful to have you with us today. And I know that you will go on and introduce your fellow panelists. And again, welcome to this event. We are eager to hear what you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction, and welcome everyone. Today, we're going to talk about an important issue: maternal and infant health in the Black community. The Naked Truth, Death by Delivery is a documentary film that aired in 2017. And it really opened up everyone's eyes about the alarming maternal mortality rates in the US, and especially among Black women. In the US, we're experiencing a crisis. And even before I continue, I just want to really make sure everyone understands what maternal mortality and infant mortality is. Maternal mortality is a death from any pregnancy-related cause. It can happen during pregnancy, during childbirth, and even the postpartum period. And in the United States, we consider any death within 12 months after delivery related to pregnancy, and we consider that maternal mortality. Infant mortality, we're looking at the death of an infant up to a year after birth. This can happen anytime after delivery, but we go up to a year. So the film really brought, again, our attention to the maternal health crisis that's happening. And it put a face on these statistics we always often hear about. So we're really going to talk about today, these experiences that the women described in the film. We heard a mother who lost her daughter. We heard from providers who know that there's an issue, and we heard from advocates as well. So today, our panelists, Hailey and Renee, are going to talk about and discuss disparities in maternal and infant mortality. We're going to talk about the historical content, and we're going to talk on a national level, but also bring it here to Connecticut. So I would like to introduce our panelists, Dr. Hailey Cole and Renee Coleman Mitchell. Could each of you tell us something about yourselves?
Okay, I guess I'll kick it off.
Okay.
Hi, everyone. I'm Haile Cole. I'm currently an assistant professor at UConn. It's my first year here, but I'm delighted to be here. I'm in the Department of Anthropology and Africana Studies. And, I've been doing research on maternal and infant health disparities for quite some time. I mean, most of my professional career, born and raised in Texas. And so my research has been mostly focused in Texas, looking at maternal and infant health disparities for Black women, but more so trying to paint a qualitative picture of what racism-induced stress looks like in the lives of Black women. So that's a lot of what my research has been. I'm looking forward to really looking at community-based interventions and healing justice around maternal health. And we'll talk a little bit about kind of what's happening around the nation in that area on the panel. But the last thing I'll add is that, a lot of my academic work really came out of community-based work that I was doing back in Texas, and organizing work on the ground around reproductive health and justice for Black and Brown folks in Texas. And so that really serves as the foundation for my understanding of the issue. And so I've been trained as a doula, I've supported women, so it's really that kind of lived experience and personal connection to the issue that has really driven my academic work over the years. So yeah, that's a little about me.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I am absolutely delighted to be here. I first like to give my thank yous, first and foremost to Dean Heller, secondly to the UConn School of Social Work, the UConn Foundation. Abigail has been a gem and very patient, but I wouldn't go further to even say at this point, I want to thank Gabrielle Celeste, who is a student who contacted me and saying, you did some work in maternal health, would you be interested? And I almost jumped through the computer and said, absolutely. So thank you all for allowing me to speak and share today. I come forward to you really with being a public health practitioner for about 3 decades, an advocate and a presenter. My background, I have a master's in public health from Yale School of Public Health. I've worked in the community. I've worked at local, state, and federal level in terms of the governmental opportunities. I am also the former commissioner for the Department of Public Health here in Connecticut. During that time, I was truly able to, with all the public health issues that were going on at that time, I was able to focus on one of my areas of priority, and that was Black maternal health. We did have a summit during during that year. Overall, it's been my goal to speak on public health issues that continue to plague African American communities, really trying to bring it to light, have dialogue, and ultimately improve our collective health as African American communities around the country, not just Connecticut. So I'm delighted to be here and looking forward to the discussion and the Q&A. Thank you.
Okay, great. And throughout our discussion, please, if you have any questions, please put it in the Q&A and not in the chat. Sometimes the questions could get lost in the chat. So, but my first question for the panelists is, what was your initial reaction when you saw death by delivery?
Okay, I'll just start. I know Isla and I are kind of playing tag here. There were a number of reactions. again, I'm sure for all of us on the panel and for you, Lucinda, it's not a surprise, but I saw it as, first and foremost, this is an opportunity to see what is going on around the country, the different pockets of the country in dealing with this issue that has been going on since the beginning of slavery here in the United States. And what was really alarming for me is to say this started many years ago with slavery, and yet here we are in the 21st century and we are dealing with this, and our rates, our mortality rates are just as bad, if not worse, than 20 years ago. So what is going on? And it kind of probed all the different areas there. And it really kind of talked about how the healthcare delivery system in the United States is not something that really supports a good birth outcome overall. I'm going to stop there, and Haile, I'm going to punt it to you, but I have a lot more feedback and comments as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think you really hit it on the head, you know, and I think for those of us who have done this work for a long time, you know, it's not surprising. And yet I find when I find myself watching these films and videos, I'm still deeply impacted by the stories that I hear, no matter how many times I hear them, you know, and how many times it happens. So, you know, sitting there and hearing the folks' stories and things like that. I mean, I'm just really saddened by the continuation of this issue, you know? And so I find myself like, you know, watching the film and trying to make space for the emotional feelings that come
Yes.
with hearing these stories,
Yes.
because you know, even as a researcher, and I was actually just talking about this to my students in class because I'm teaching a reproductive health class, and I'm like, I've taught this class so many times, and every time I teach it, it's difficult for me. It's my lived experience and my sisters and my mothers and my friends, you know. So it's very, very personal, and that doesn't change no matter how much research I do or how many books that I read. And so you know, that the film was very impactful for me in that way. I also really appreciate the kind of comprehensive approach that they took to the documentary. I mean, part of what's been fascinating me over the years is the large media attention that's growing around the issue and the various narratives that get told about Black women's health, you know? So I was really excited to see that they just directly address the issue of racism, and they, you know, they talk to doctors and they talk to researchers, and I'm always kind of waiting to see how folks talk about racism when it comes to maternal health. I'm always curious. I'm kind of like, you know, are we going to address this head on? Are we going to tiptoe around it? And I was really relieved and happy that they were addressing that in the film. I found that really important. So I think it was really, really good job and a really good conversation starter for sure.
Yeah, right. I just also have one other comment. I mean, I agree absolutely with everything that you said. I really wanted it always to be told that people think that if you address the social determinants of health, if you have a good education, you have your socioeconomic status, you live in a great neighborhood, all these social determinants of health, if they're addressed, then that will fix it. And what clearly came out of this is that that is not the case. That if you have a Black woman who is at that status of that of a highly educated white woman, why is it that that Black woman still has high mortality, maternal mortality rates? And that goes back to that systemic, that structural racism that exists. And it's for us as Black women, it is the race of being a Black person and also that of a woman, if you look at the historical perspective. So it kind of hits home. And I will also take it to this point on a personal level. I have two beautiful children, but I've also lost two. And the experience that I had myself to see and hear what was going on in the documentary, it really just kind of hit home, even personally for me. And I'm sure there's many women that are watching, as well as maybe on the panel, that can share some of their experiences as well. So I'm thankful for this documentary to occur. And it really is a true basis from where we should hit off. What I am tired of, though, is the discussion and what should be done and throwing money at the problem. It's now really time to take action and go beyond just our discussions and the funding is to really make a difference, because this is all preventable, right? So that's my comments.
Yeah, no, Renee, you said some powerful things there. First of all, you went all the way back to slavery, but there was something important that you said, because this is the United States. We have
Yes.
all these scientists, all these hospitals, specialists, but you said something that really resonated with me. You said that the outcomes are worse than 20 years ago. And that's amazing to me. So what are, like people don't really understand like structural racism, what that means. So what are the root causes of why this continues to happen, especially with all the resources that we have?
Yes. Well, I can teach a whole course on this topic, but for the moment, I'm going to kind of zone in, and I really want people to pay attention. I'm going to share a definition of structural racism that I chose by the Aspen Institute, if people want to look at it later, because it really gives you a comprehensive definition, and it hits home for the basis and the foundation of the United States and what it was built on. The structural definition of structural racism is the public policies, the institutional practices, the cultural representations, and norms that are reinforcing ways to perpetuate racial group inequity. It identifies dimensions of our history, our culture, that has allowed privileges associated with whiteness and disadvantages associated with color to endure and adapt. Structural racism is not by a few, it's by a system that has been a feature of the social, economic, and political systems. So if you look at the 1500s, 1600s of start of slavery, chattel slavery, which is a person owning individuals or others, that where people and women were captured in their native continent of Africa and brought over here and enslaved. It was much more of a different experience for an enslaved woman than that of the enslaved man and enslaved children. The reason I say that is because Black women, and I'm going to say enslaved women, and we're going to, for the sake of this conversation, assume they were Black from Africa, that they were considered capital asset of the highest. Why? Not only could they do the field work, but they also could produce additional children within slavery that increased the wealth and the capitalism of white slave owners, European slave owners here in the United States. There was no maternal care provided unless there was a difficult pregnancy. And that's a different topic. That was the very beginning of the difference of how Black enslaved women were treated. They were treated as property, wealth, capital, no maternal treatment or care given during that time. And it was a very common thing to have over 50% of mortality for moms, for the maternal mortality and infant mortality to occur. I will tell you, I've been blessed to still have two great aunts that are in their 90s. And they talked very clearly about it was for them and our family a very common thing to have. More than likely, if you had 5 children, you really birthed 10 because it was a given that you would have high infant mortality. And some of them lost their lives during that time. I will tell you that it was such a profit to have enslaved women that the state of Virginia passed legislation that said you obtain the status of your mother as born as a child. So if a slave mother gave birth, that child was automatically a slave. When the transatlantic slave trade shut down, it was more incumbent upon slave owners to then and to more than likely impregnate these women to have children, because again, it was a sign of wealth and capitalism. We also know about the history of surgeons and physicians who have taken a lead in using Black enslaved women as lab specimens. And it has been one of those situations where you look at this like, okay, how were they treated? They were treated as property. There was no anesthesia, and they were treated very differently than white women in regards to white women were seen as contributing to mankind and the growth of the country, whereas Black enslaved women were seen as contributing in the sense of their wealth and their capitalism. So this is something that really hits home in terms of all the things that we have seen, even after slavery ended. We have the foundations of these physicians that have their beliefs move forward with what the teachings were in medical schools regarding the beliefs that black women had less nerve endings, tougher skin, can tolerate pain. We have seen it come all the way up to what's taken place with Kira Johnson and the Kira Johnson Act. We've seen it take place with Serena Williams and the experience that she has had. We have also seen studies show in 2016 when they talked to students, medical students, and it wasn't necessarily in the books of their medical school curriculum, but their beliefs and their myths was very, very much built upon the fact that Black people, Black women especially, could tolerate much more pain because there was less in regards to the nerve endings and the skin color and what we've been through. These are things that were built upon the foundation. So when you look at the definition of structural racism being social, economic, and political, this country was built on the backs of Black enslaved women being able to produce children and being considered as capital. And because of these beliefs, they have been perpetuated from slavery to this day. And that's why you get to that point as to why is it, if we address social determinants of health, we hit all those high spots, education, social economic status, great neighborhoods, nutrition, great jobs, all of that. Why is it that Black women still have high mortality rates? It goes to racial discrimination. And what comes with that is the stress that has taken its toll on their trajectory of life that impacts that birthing outcome.
Yes. So as a system is failing Black women.
Absolutely.
And that brings us to the United States ranks 50 among all countries in terms of maternal health outcomes, maternal mortality. So Hailey, could you tell us more about like the statistics, like people don't really understand that. So where are we at nationally? And then Renee, if you could touch on Connecticut.
Sure. So I have some slides, only because, when you're spouting out numbers, sometimes it's helpful to see graphs. So, just to kick us off, I mean, this was stated with Dr. Canty early on, but, Black women have been found 3 to 4 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related complications compared to white women, and Black infants are found to be 2.5 times more likely to die before their first birthday. So let's look at a couple of the more recent numbers. Let's kind of see what that looks like. So we can go to the next slide. Yeah. So this is taken from the National Center for Health Statistics. These are infant mortality rates by race for 2018. So the first kind of block that we see is the infant mortality rates for all races, and we see it's around 5.67. Next, you see the statistics for Hispanic or Latina identified women, 4.86. We see white non-Hispanic, 4.63. And then we see Black or African-American women at 10.75, the infant mortality rate. This is the data that they have for 2018. And we see, and obviously these racial categories are based on kind of census data, right? And how they categorize folks. So we have the Asian population, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, and American Indian or Alaskan Native. So we can see visually here these really large disparity, around infant mortality rates. What I also find interesting, although we're talking about, Black women's health, I find also interesting the Native Hawaiian and the American Indian rates as well. Mm-hmm. And I always like to bring that to light because it's really important, that American Indian and Indigenous folks aren't erased in this conversation, so I always like to bring that in there too. But even with that, we can see here just how large the infant mortality disparities are for Black women. We can go to the next slide. So similarly, you know, I know we're talking about mortality, but we see these disparities in kind of other outcome markers for pregnancy and birth. So here we're looking at low birth weight for as a measurable outcome for Black women. So here we only have three groups. We have Hispanic or Latina identified birthing folk. We have white folk at 6.89. And here we see the low birth weight rates for Black birthing folk at 14.15. So even outside of mortality, if we're just looking at low birth weight, and then the next slide that I'll show you is preterm birth, right? So these are really important kind of indicators for kind of long-term health outcomes for that infant, right? So preterm birth rates by race as well. And so I won't go through all the numbers, but as you can see, in general, we aren't doing super well, right? So for all races, it's 10.23. But when we break it down by race, we see those disparities like showing up again. So with Black birthing folk at 14.39% as the preterm birth rate. We can go to the next slide. So we've been talking about maternal mortality. So the earlier slides were looking at infant mortality and infant birth outcomes, so low-term birth and preterm birth. And so these are the statistics from 2018. This is taken from, it's an infographic from the National Center of Health Statistics and looking at maternal mortality rates. So we can see these huge disparities here. Non-Hispanic Black women, 37.3 compared to non-Hispanic white women at 14.9 and Hispanic women at 18.8. I mean, the gap is really huge. And I know we're going to talk a little bit later about kind of legislation and things. What's interesting is that over the years, it's been really hard to capture maternal mortality data because there were no standards kind of across the state to kind of capture that information. And there's been a lot of changes lately so that, you know, states are collecting the data and doing it in such a way that we have better data, more standard collection practices and things like that. So hopefully, as this, you know, improves over the years, we'll even have a clearer picture of what's happening around maternal mortality here in the United States. But this is from 2018, so we can still see these huge disparities. So next slide. So, you know, I wanted to add, I have two quick slides, and because I wanted to add a little bit to what Renee was talking about in terms of the history. And so, and tying it to the statistics. So one of the statistics that I always cite that really, you know, catches people off guard, because Renee was talking about kind of an educated Black woman. So regardless of kind of socioeconomic status and income and education or access to prenatal care, you know, when you control for all of those kind of components, we still see these horrible outcomes. And so a study was conducted in New York in 2016, and it found that a Black college-educated mother was more likely to suffer pregnancy-related complications than white mothers with no high school diploma, which is really interesting because, you know, most folks kind of coming into this conversation assume that, you know, the older you get, the more educated you become, the more how you raise up the socioeconomic ladder, the more access you have to resources, that will improve your birth outcome. That's what people think, right? And we see from the data that while that might work, particularly for white folk, you know, as they become more stable economically and become more educated, then they're, you know, it improves their outcomes. But for Black folk, it actually does not work that way.
Correct.
So it's very interesting and really complicated. So I want to talk a little bit about that. So I'm so grateful for Renee talking about this history of slavery, because she's absolutely right, right? But there's kind of two things happening here, right? We have kind of the discrimination piece and kind of the ways in which not only, you know, this country is built on from slavery, these kind of racial hierarchies that manifest in these various inequities, right, that we see in health and otherwise, right? And also the ways in which kind of the Black reproductive body and the Black woman was used as a vessel for breeding during slavery, and kind of the ideological underpinnings that come with that, right? So how does the medical healthcare system kind of see Black women, right? And we hear these stories in the news. You know, the biggest one, obviously, everyone talks about Serena Williams, but at the root of her story is really the fact that she was not heard, right? she was saying something is wrong and I need you to listen to me, and, you know, and having to really advocate to be heard in the medical system. And so there are plenty of stories around mistreatment and kind of discrimination in care. And Serena isn't the only one. You know, there's the few that make it to the media and get media attention. And unfortunately, oftentimes it's the folks like Serena or the folks who don't make it that make it to the media. But this happens every day, you know, for Black women who are seeking care. But on the other side of that is, you know, and this was one of the really great pieces of the film that I liked, is the interviewer says at one point, she's talking to a researcher, a psychiatrist, and she says, "So racism can kill?" And the researcher says, yes, right? So there's also something physiologically happening in your body as a result of racism-induced stress. One of the researchers that's very well known about this weathering hypothesis is Arlene Geronimus. And these ideas of like weathering and stress age and allostatic load are basically talking about the perpetual and incessant stress that a Black woman feels over the course of her life, and the long-term kind of eroding of that overall health over time because of that stress. So some folks might have seen the Unnatural Causes video, in Sickness and in Wealth, When the Bow Breaks. And the example that is shared there and that I often share in conversations is thinking about a car engine, right? You rev the engine and it does, you know, it wears and tears on the engine when you hit the gas. But, you know, sometimes we take our foot off, we let the car rest, we do maintenance and things like that. So imagine stress as that gas, and imagine you push it all the way down and you never let it up. Imagine the wear and tear on that engine. And you know, racism-induced stress is the same thing. So, and what's also really important, this is what's really fascinating, and I'll stop here, I know I'm talking quite a bit, is when you look at the literature, the impacts of this weathering and this racism-induced stress begins when a Black child is born. So if you look at kind of experiences of racism at a young age, those have been found to be, you know, related to birth outcomes for Black women in adulthood, right? So, and in continuing kind of this line of thought, you know, thinking about the ways in which, oh, I just lost my train of thought. I'm so sorry. Yes, so racism-induced stress over the life course, thinking about the ways in which Black women just stress over the life course, racism-induced stress over the life course, and how it weathers your body from the time you're born. And it's not even, you know, people want to assume that it's, you know, kind of direct incidences of racism that are weathering our body. And while those matter, because they do, just the knowledge and the potential of experiencing racism, just the lived embodiment of being a Black woman in America and what that means has an impact on that person's body and causes stress.
Yes.
So it's really important to kind of see both sides of that, the discrimination, but also just, you know, what it means to be Black in America and how that impacts health and wellness. So I will stop there.
No, but that's very important what you're saying. And just think of the Black woman or Black person is that we can't say one day I'm going to be Black and one day I'm not. So every single thing, like Dr. Coleman mentioned earlier, every single thing that we experience, we're experiencing as a Black person. And it's just very clear that it's doing something to us. Okay, and so Renee, how does this look in Connecticut?
Well, before we get to the Connecticut statistics, I wanted to commend ILA for articulately putting it in play, what is really going on. And it is a point in time now that people recognize that lifetime of stress does have its own outcome. And for us as Black people in the United States, it is not good. So we speak about, you know, today, you know, maternal mortality, infant mortality, but we recognize as Black people in the United States that the impact that it has had, it is shown in the data. The data speaks the truth. That's the science behind it all, that data. And if you look at all of the chronic diseases, and why is it that we as Black people in the United States have the highest rates of chronic disease with heart disease and cancer and stroke. I mean, we can go on. And it has a lot to do with, and I have said it for many a times, the structural racism in the United States as the root cause for the maternal mortality, infant mortality, but it goes beyond that topic. But for today, yes, we are talking about maternal mortality and infant mortality. I just want to lastly say before I get into the slides is that there was a time, and I've been, like I said, 3 decades of public health practicing. I will tell you that the theory that, stress and being a Black and being stressed having the physiological impact to have a negative outcome on the body, period, let alone being that giving birth, was not an accepted theory at the time, and that was years ago. And through time, it has really been proven that it does have an impact. Again, the data speaks the truth. So with that, I wanted to take some time to quickly focus on Connecticut. I have over 21 years at the Department of Public Health. I was able to connect with them and get some of the data. They are working on really trying to improve the maternal mortality rates here in Connecticut. So I have 3 very specific slides that talk about a timeline of 2015 through 2017. These are the pregnancy-associated deaths by pregnancy relatedness. And so what you'll see is a count. And I want to state very clearly that pregnancy associated deaths are deaths of a mother who dies while pregnant or up to a year after, as it was stated earlier. But pregnancy associated deaths is the huge title, the hierarchy definition, but it also under it means pregnancy associated deaths is by any cause. So it could be directly related to the pregnancy, or it could be something that happened that's not the cause. The pregnancy is not the cause, but it happened during the fact that the mom was pregnant. And there needs to be some conversation about that, because right now, before we get to the next slides, and I'm going to hit this one, is that there's a lot of discussion about the impact of what's taken place in Connecticut regarding being Black in Connecticut, the stress related to being Black in America, and the impact that it's had in the Black community dealing with violence, dealing with I want to call it, what do I want to say? Homicides, as well as also intake of drugs. So the pregnancy associated count for 2015 through 2017 was 32. And you will see it broken out for 2015, 2016, and 2017. And as I indicated, pregnancy associated is for any cause of death of that mother during the time that she's giving birth, but also up to a year after. Not pregnancy related, you see the numbers for 2015 are 3, 2016 are 8, 2017 are 8, and the total count was 19. The ones that are pregnancy related, that speak specifically to what Ayele stated regarding the physiological impact and the stress, the lifetime of stress that we as Black people experience in the United States, and this is specific to Connecticut. These are 3 for 2015, 5 for 2016, and 2017 is 3. Total being for the 3-year period was 11. I have to share with you that the data has been being collected. I imagine it will be in a better shape of being collected, but I wanted to break it down even more so with the pregnancy related deaths that took place between 2015 and 2017. Of those 11, 7 of those were a medical disorder, whether it be related to hypertension or infection. 3 of them were mental health and 1 was undetermined. Most of those deaths occurred on the day of delivery or postpartum. The pregnancy associated deaths, the 32 count, that's all inclusive. They averaged about 8 to 13 pregnancy associated deaths per year. And basically they were, again, mainly medical with cardiomyopathy, stroke, malignancy, accidental overdose, which is a key issue here in Connecticut as well, mental health and homicides. Next slide, please. This one talks about the limited economic resources during pregnancy, and I think that this kind of hits home to some of the topic of social determinants of health and the impact in the Black community. But I also want to make it clear that this is talking about the pregnancy-associated deaths, that number 32 for the time frame of 2015 through 2017. Again, that block of time that the department was able to collect and show data. What you'll see clearly is the insurance at the time of delivery was the Medicaid at 18 count at 56.3%. Private insurance is 21.9%, and other and unknown was 21.9%. So clearly, the majority of the women experiencing pregnancy-associated deaths were very much by this percentage stated here on Medicaid, state assistance in terms of their care. There's a lot of discussion about having states making sure that they have the extension of Medicaid coverage for women who give birth up until a year after, because many of these deaths occur on the day of delivery or up to a year after the end of the pregnancy. When you look at it by race, let's take a look. You see for Blacks, the count is 12, with it being 37.5%. Latinx being count of 6 at 18.8%, and white, it being at 43.8%. I go back now to look at the education and the age group, and you'll see that we have a number of the individuals at the highest as high school graduate, but you have some college, right? 28.1% as well. And it goes back to, again, looking at, and I bet if you cross-referenced this data, which we don't have that access to, at the department doesn't have access to right now, but to look at how many of these Black and even Latinx women were college educated out of that 9 count that still experienced this pregnancy-associated death. And then you looked at the age range really at 20 to 24. So that kind of gives you some idea where they're at in regards to finishing high school and also being potentially at the college level. Next slide, please. So this is the slide that really also hits home, the proportion of pregnancy-related deaths. These are specific to the death was related to the pregnancy that occurred among persons of color, exceeded their representation among those giving birth. So I'm going to go right straight to the third graphic, which says of color, 63.6% versus white, 36.4%. for pregnancy-related deaths. This clearly indicates that here in Connecticut, that there is a higher proportion, a higher rate of pregnancy-related deaths among people of color in the state of Connecticut that we must address. When I had asked if they could break down that of color even more, they weren't unable to at the time, but I imagine as the department continues to collect data, they will be able to break it down. But it is of note to notice 63.6% pregnancy-related deaths as opposed to white people, 36.4%. Clearly, we have a problem here in Connecticut in regards to the higher rate and proportions of pregnancy-related associated deaths among people, women of color here in Connecticut. That's it.
Okay, so please put questions in the Q&A. We are going to have a Q&A session towards the end. I already see some good questions there.
Mm-hmm.
So, but prenatal care is supposed to help with this. And in the film, they talked about, women in the rural area having access to care. Is access to care an issue in Connecticut?
I will give credit to the fact that it's been brought to light that this is an issue. The state of Connecticut recently, within the last couple of years, applied to the federal government, CDC, Centers for Disease Control, as well as HRSA and a couple of other federal agencies for support in addressing this concern of maternal mortality in the state of Connecticut and infant mortality. But as I said very early on, you can bring in the money as much as you can, but you really got to look at this entire systemic issue in Connecticut, because it's not just having access. And I will give credit where credit is due. Connecticut has definitely improved and providing access to care. But if that care comes with its own frame and definition and bias and beliefs and myths that's been taught through medical schools to our medical students and to our providers here and that have gone through these medical systems, who continue to have their beliefs in the way that they treat women, who women, when you speak with them, have their stories. I even have my own. Then what good is it if you have access when the access is not sensitive to the cultural nature in which Black women have experienced racism and the impact that it's had on their bodies?
And Hailey, you also mentioned that. You talked about how Serena Williams, look all that money she has. So can you please touch on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Renee hit it on the head. I mean, when I was doing work in Texas, I can't speak for Connecticut, and I did some work with the public health department there. They were looking at who was accessing care and at what point. And what they found for Black women was that Black women were accessing care. Like they were accessing care. Now, depending on whether their insurance status and things like that might impact the quality of care and kind of their experience and satisfaction with the care. So there were, surveys on that as well. But as we can see from Serena, you can have money and pay for the best doctor and you still have, you're still discriminated against, or you still have a negative experience. So, it's not to say that prenatal care doesn't matter. I mean, we want birthing folk to get prenatal care, but, it's really, if you're looking at the systemic piece of it and the kind of healthcare provision piece of it, then you really have to look at what is your service model? Is it patient-centered? Is it culturally based? Like, all of those things. And it really calls into question, like there's a recent study, I mentioned this, we were chatting before about kind of about the finding that Black doctors, when providing care for Black birthing folk, had better outcomes. So what is that about? You know what I'm saying? And then when you read the kind of Washington Post, they like, oh, these were the findings, but we don't understand why. And it's like, well, let's dig into that a little bit. Let's think a little bit about what might be happening in those interactions, and it's not to say that like every Black doctor is better or whatever, but if we see it to the extent that it's impacting outcomes that, in a research study, then we need to really be asking like, what is happening there? What's really kind of impacting these outcomes in this way? And I think it speaks to kind of what Renee is talking about. You can't just access any old care and think that it's gonna have an outcome.
Aile, you hit it on the head. There was a group of women that talked about death by delivery, some of the feedback, and I was watching it the other day, and it really hit home what you just said. It was one of the presenters, one of the panelists, she said, what is this whole thing about getting training in cultural competency? You can go through that cultural competency training 101 as a provider, as a practitioner, but does that really mean that you're culturally competent, that that's going to make a difference, that you're no longer going through a 1 or a half a day of a cultural competency training and getting a certificate, and that's my added piece, to say that you no longer have implicit bias, that you no longer treat people of color, specifically for this conversation, Black women, in a way that is supporting your beliefs and what you were taught in medical school. So we have a lot more to do than just to say that we need to have cultural competency training. It is what you indicated by the study that was in the Washington Post, that what is that? That if you have someone who looks like you, who can feel like you, who's been there with you, that makes all the difference. Because as much as I agree that there should be some basis of cultural competency, it is not going to change the fact of you living my experience and knowing what it really means. And so that leads to a bigger discussion about what do we do further besides the cultural competency. So you hit it right on the head, Aile, you really did.
Yes, yes. And so important. And we need another panel discussion about that, because we really have to address that issue. Because I've seen people with my own eyes go to trainings and come back behaving the same way.
Yes.
Even worse. So, but What is done on a national level, and even what's done in Connecticut to address this issue?
Well, I can just talk very briefly. There's some of the initiatives, but I think what's key is that first and foremost, we're finally at a point of having the dialogue about maternal mortality and infant mortality in the Black community. Thank you, Jesus. Thank you, right? And when you look at the statistics on a national scale, some people because we're always used to very large numbers. And I cringe when it's only 700 maternal deaths in the United States that's been recorded. And I say, let it be just one. That's way too many. That's someone's spouse, someone's daughter, someone's mother, someone's sister, right? And at the same time, it's a bigger indicator of what's really going on. When you look at maternal health and infant mortality, these are indicators about the community that they come from. So we as a Black people have bigger issues to deal with. And this is mainly one of the main ones because it being a health indicator. So the federal government recognizes this wonderfully. It's been Congress women that have come forth and have made this an issue. So there's a lot of legislation that's moving on the federal level. There is the Momnibus Act that's occurring that gives money for different initiatives, trainings, addressing racism. There's the Kira Johnson Act. So there's a lot of monies, I shouldn't say a lot, some monies at the federal level, plus legislation that are occurring. And I know the ILA probably has more to add. I know in Connecticut right now, we have legislation that I believe was passed in 2018 in Connecticut that allowed us to look at maternal mortality and put together a maternal mortality review committee that was put together at the department with community-based folks, practitioners, really representative of who needs to be on it to look at these factors. And that's why I was able to present this data. But prior to that, it wasn't funded through the state. It was half-handed in terms of the funding to support the initiative. And now with legislation in Connecticut, it does exist. And this is the beginning to really blow this wide open and look at it much closer. And then there's also the legislation that's currently pending this legislative session regarding the doulas, because they see the key in accessing this service and having someone by your side that looks like you, who can relate to you, to assist you, whatever your needs may be, that it's being a doula, which is in my mind, more of a specified community health worker who can really be by your side and make all the difference. And so I know the state legislature, it's supported by Senator Marilyn Moore and a couple of others who are looking to get that legislation passed so that doulas are recognized as a profession. It can be a reimbursable type of service so that it really will assist our women of color here in Connecticut.
Yes.
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit to that. I mean, Renee hit a lot of things I was going to talk about. I mean, there's definitely things happening on the federal level, finding monies and, even, changing the policy about collecting maternal mortality data, like the things that happen via policy. She also talked about the expansion of Medicaid. Like these are all things that are happening at the policy level to try to address the issue. And that there's like federal things, and then there's things that are happening state by state around the country. Really exciting, and I'm particularly excited about the legislation around doulas, finding funding to pay doulas to support folks, or letting them to be able to be reimbursed by Medicaid for their services. Like these types of things are happening all over the country, which is really exciting. And I was thinking about something that you said earlier, Renee. You were talking about like throwing money at the problem. And, I think that having money is good, but the question is, what direction are we throwing the money? You know what I'm saying? Like, so, and so like, because of my community-based work, there are people on the ground not only doing this work right now, but they've been doing it. If I can just be, really blunt about it, Black folks in these communities have been working to support each other since the Black Granny Midwife, what I'm saying? And so, we have folks who are like, you know what, these healthcare systems need reform and we're not being treated right. And that takes time. That doesn't mean we don't do that systemic work. But in the meantime, we're going to support ourselves. And so, these community-based birthing projects are really popping up. And that's where the money needs to go, quite frankly, if I can just, be honest about how I feel about things, And so, I think it's a question of, get the money, but who are you giving that money to? Are you giving it to the communities who are directly impacted? Are you looking at the new models that are working in these community-based, because evidence-based is important, but there are these really, culturally rooted, culturally based, holistic kind of comprehensive wraparound models that people are trying to develop to address all of the issues that we talked about today. But how are they able to access the money if they, if at all, right? And so those are some of the questions. So there were really amazing things happening, but how do we get the resources to those folks? How do we do that, and I'm hoping that the momentum behind the issue will shift those resources to, to folks and communities and things like that who have been doing this work anyways,
Exactly. One of the last things I want to add, and I forgot to mention it, is UConn has put together what's called, it's got this acronym of UN and then the acronym from REST, unrest, and it's a racial and ethnic stress trauma survey. And I guess that this is a start, right? To have a survey that can somehow quantify what your racial ethnic stress trauma has been, whether it's been ongoing or an event or an incident that has occurred. But my understanding is that UConn is utilizing this particular tool, and I'm hoping, and I've had a quick review of it, that it kind of is used in a manner that people can really at least have something. Like you said, Ayla, it's starting somewhere. But like you said, this has been happening since day one, right? With our communities taking care of each other. That's who the Black community really, really is and has been.
Yes, and you're both touched on one. I have one final question, but I have to say, we have to trust that Black women know how to take care of issues that impact Black women.
Hello.
That's what
Yes.
you are saying. So just one last question. And again, you both touched on it, but what can members of the audience, what can people do to address this issue?
Do you want us to talk about locally how people can get connected, Renee?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, well, first, I just need to say that it's not a one answer for all. It's truly a multi-pronged approach. One of the things I always come from that public health perspective, that it's always good to get your community leaders, your legislators to be your strong voice to get legislation, as you said, Ayla, as well as funding. And right now, as I indicated, one of the main legislators is out of Bridgeport, now my mind went blank. It's Senator Moore out of Bridgeport, who's putting forth that doula legislation. And there's a couple of other women legislators that are supporting that as well. But it really is looking and finding out what's going on in your community. There are some pockets of community activity, but I always say there's something to be said about organizing it and bringing it forth. So if you know of someone in your community, and it would be, could be your faith-based leader, it could be a community activist, or that's really going to be speaking on this issue, or it could be someone who's from the healthcare system. And there are, with COVID-19 in this last year or so, there's been a number of our individuals of color from the Black community who have become, self-proclaimed leaders and speakers. This is something that needs to be brought forth and organized on a community level. I always say educate, legislate, and activate is the key to getting this done. I'm not aware of any very specific community-based, and I'm sure they do exist throughout the state right now, but I always encourage that if there is, that it needs to come forth and kind of show as a model for other cities and towns in Connecticut. But at this point, I'm not aware of anything specifically.
Yeah, I mean, I really like what you said about the multi-pronged approach, because I've worked in this issue for a while and I teach students, at the end of the class, I was like, well, what do we do? And it's like, there's lots of intervention points and you have to kind of figure out what makes sense for you. I mean, we've talked about legislation, you can kind of pay attention. Maybe you're interested in policy work. If you can find a community-based org, there's also national orgs like Black Mamas Matter and Song and all of these groups that are working on this issue, and national birth equity with Joy Perry. I mean, there are people who are really working on it. So there's ways that you can, become involved with things that they're doing or support their work. I've had students who became doulas and, fundraise to do a doula training on campus. So there's lots of different things that you can do. It's really just kind of tapping into what's happening and figuring out, how you can participate and what you can contribute.
Right.
The other thing that I'll say is that, I talked a little bit about kind of like systemic change and kind of short-term things that you can do and kind of short-term responses versus kind of long-term. And to kind of bring us back to the very beginning, when Renee kicked us off, if we're talking about racism and we're talking about stress, one thing you can do is help fight, racial injustice across the board. I mean, when you were talking about, Renee, kind of the impacts of racism and stress on chronic health, like, these structural inequities bleed into every aspect of life, not just health. And so, if you want to impact Black women's maternal health, we need to end systemic racism. Now, I know that's big. Everybody's like, well, how do you do that? But, if you're doing your part to push health equity and racial equity, then you're contributing to improving Black women's maternal health in that work as well. So I think that's really important for us to keep in mind, like we can try to fix systems and we can change policy. But at the end of the day, just like the film said, racism is deadly, so if you aren't, trying to eradicate that, then we're going to be in the same place, right? So it's like keeping that in mind too, as a way to kind of like work on the issue.
Yes, and I feel that racism harms everyone, and everyone can do something from where they sit, because we know, like Renee, what you said is throughout our system, it's every part of our lives. So where you sit, look at how racism is impacting you, and are you participating in it? Are you a bystander, or are you even being victimized by it? That we all need to look at where we're at with this. So I would like to get to the questions that are in the our Q&A box. So the first question asks, how are these issues being addressed in medical school, if at all? Are there classes on structural racism, in the medical field, bedside manner, are they mandatory?
I'm just going to throw something out, and I know we both started smiling, right? Because we know. So unfortunately, there's that strong, it goes back to structural racism and what's been taught in medical schools from what has been considered the founders or the fathers of gynecology obstetrics, with the names of Francois Provost, or I forgot the other gentleman, the other guy from the slavery days, who did lab experimentation on Black enslaved women. And because they were considered the forefathers of gynecology obstetrics, what their thoughts and beliefs were kind of founded in the curriculum, in the medical school teachings. And through time, it may not be explicitly stated that Black people have less nerve endings and can tolerate more pain, as an example, but these beliefs and myths are still perpetuated when they did a 2016 survey of medical students and asked them their beliefs. So the curriculum, there's a current that exists right now. I was reading an article out of Harvard Medical School, race-based medicine, and it is dynamic, in which it shares these medical students were questioning, and these happen to be some medical students of color, not of African-American ancestry, but just questioning, well, why is it that there's a different standard of care for African-Americans versus other? And they were just told, well, that's just the standard of care, never given any reason. So students, people are becoming much more open and honest about asking why. Why is there a difference? so it is starting to be addressed. Is it part of the overall curriculum as part of the core curriculum for medical students? Not to my knowledge, it isn't. And I'm not going to say I know it all, but I will tell you that in most cases, it's at least being addressed to a certain degree. But it still needs to be part of the core curriculum to discuss these issues. And why is it the standard of care based on what beliefs started many years ago through structural racism still exists to this day?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I echo the same thing. I mean, really depends on the medical school. You know, I know some that are trying to do this work. I gave a talk at U Chicago Medical School last year, and they had a racism and health disparities kind of intro course for all their first years. You know, so these conversations are starting to happen, but is it standard across the board for every medical school? You know, no. And you know, having taught students who take my classes because they're going to medical school, they'll email me and be like, oh my gosh, none of my classmates know anything about Marion J. Sims, or they don't know anything. They haven't read Medical Apartheid by Harriet Washington, you know, like, which should be like mandatory reading for every medical school student, you know? So I think that could be a really important intervention. And it's happening slowly, I would say, but probably not. Well, not probably, not enough, and not fast enough.
Yes.
Yes, and I think we touched on this next question, but is there any correlation between mortality rates to the ACEs study and the adverse childhood experiences? So we did talk about trauma and how that can have an impact on that, you know, during trauma during pregnancy, prior to pregnancy, again, that chronic stress,
From
intergenerational trauma.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, as far as the ACEs study specifically, the ACEs like survey specifically, I know that there are some studies out there that look at its connection to maternal health. I can't think of one off the top of my head that's specifically for African American women. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I just can't bring it forth off the top of my head. But there are definitely studies that look at kind of experiences of racial trauma or racism at a young age and kind of its impacts on the mortality. So that does exist for sure.
But as I always say, when people say, what else can I do? Well, this could be an area of study for those of you that want to go on and continue to bring this particular topic to light. That could be a focus area for you to do your thesis or your PhD or whatever it may be going forward, because there's so many facets to this. It really is.
Yes, and another question, how does policy impact this issue? I know we touched on this a little as well.
Well, again, I can only tell you that looking at the federal level, there are a number of congresswomen from different Georgia, which has a high rate of maternal mortality, DC. They actually had, it was Congresswoman Adams, I believe, who started the legislation with the Mom Numbers Act, and she got about 20 plus other congresswomen to sign on from varying states. That's huge, because again, historically, to talk about and address women's health was considered, for white women, was considered something that you really didn't do, right? And that's why we as Black women became one of the reasons why we became such ones to be experimented on. So to bring this to light, and I looked at it and I was like, wow, this is the 21st, and here we are dealing with this as an issue that should have been incorporated. So policy makes a difference, that these congresswomen are making people aware of what's going on in their own states or districts, Washington, DC, and passing legislation and trying to get monies appropriated. It makes a difference when you put what the issues are supported by data and put it into legislation. Then you can act on it and continue to move forward with it. And that's what's happened with the Mom Numbers Act, where it has 12 different areas of focus that in terms of giving money and trainings, but it was also, it started years ago, a couple of years ago, and it's been continued. So policy is huge. And that's one of the things I always say with public health, is that it's about looking at the policy and how you can touch many people versus one individually as a practitioner and a clinician. They go hand in hand in terms of looking at the policy to impact the population whole as a whole versus the individual.
Yeah, Absolutely. The only thing I'll add is that, when a lot of this stuff was coming to a head in the media and like, particular states were getting called out for their horrible maternal health outcomes and they didn't like it. Texas was one of them, so they're like, no. So then legislation gets passed where they create a maternal mortality task force, to look deeper at the issues, so policy, is not the end all be all, but it's a really important kind of piece of the framework for addressing the issue. And I think that it's a really important piece of it for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, now, this next question is an important one. How would you all recommend Black women prepare to advocate for themselves during labor? How do we know what's okay and to say no to and what's not?
Yeah,
This is a big one. There's lots of little pieces to this.
Yeah.
a big one. I mean, like my initial reaction is like, like educating yourself, about the issues and things like that. But, it's really unfortunate, I think, that given the circumstances, that our reaction is like, well, we got to save ourselves, we got to educate ourselves, and we got to, because it's like we have these structures that are like impacting, our bodies or whatever. But, I mean, learning as much as you can. I think that that's why doulas are so important and birth workers, because, in that moment when you're in labor and maybe you've done a birth plan and maybe you know what you want, but it could be a really stressful moment, right? And so to have another person there to advocate for you and who can, think through things with you, and it's not just even in the labor process, like you have another person to plan and strategize before you get there. And then you have another voice to advocate for you while you're in labor. And then you have that kind of postpartum support as well. And, like, I think it's really important that people understand what a doula is. I mean, they're a labor support person, they're not a midwife, but also, they have these certification programs. You can be a doula, but a doula can be your partner or your sister or your, you know what I'm saying? Like, it's really just about having someone there to support you and to advocate for you throughout the pregnancy, during the labor, and after. So I think, there is this education piece, but I also feel like it's really about having that network around you. That there's really some power in numbers in terms of the advocacy and protection, if we could just be blunt, so.
Yeah. I have to tell you, I feel compelled to share just briefly, personally, with my first child. Hey, we went through the Lamaze classes. I read the books. I talked to other people who have had children. I just thought I was well versed and ready, as much as you can be, right? So I had my husband in the delivery room. I had my mom, and I'll never forget. As you said, Haile, it is a very stressful, and let's to be honest, I did it naturally. So it was a very painful time as well. And I'll never forget, to this day, I had my child in the hospital. There was this nurse, this white nurse, who was just very rude, crude, and the way she spoke to me, the way she treated me, and I knew it. And I thought, how can she be this way as such what should be a beautiful moment in time? But I didn't address it, right? Because I'm still dealing with the pain and the whole issue of giving birth and the contractions. And I remember so vividly when her shift was over and she left and another nurse came in to replace her, and it was like night and day. And my son is 23 years old, and I still reflect on that moment, that I thought that, hey, I'm educated, well empowered, I speak up, thinking I will if something happens. But during that moment in time, my husband was concentrated on soothing me. My mother was just, exhilarated and having her first grandchild. It is great if you could have that team, that advocate, like you said, because honestly, that was one of the roughest situations, to have a rough nurse to assist at the time. And as you hear, I said 23 years later, I still speak of it as it happened the other day. And it was no need for that.
Yes. And that's first I have to say, you're not alone in that. That story is heard over and over again about how people are treated during childbirth, especially Black women. And myself as a nurse midwife, I wish I had a doula, because I was saying yes to everything. So I wish I had a doula. Even when I had to bring my baby, they were like, it's time for you to be discharged. I was like, I have to bring him home with me by myself. So I wish I had a doula postpartum. But one thing I do want to let people know, and you have the right to have providers that you trust, that you feel comfortable with. And we have to go with our intuition. If something doesn't feel right, you have a right to say, I need somebody else.
Yes.
And you have that nurse that's acting that way, you have a right to say, I need another nurse.
Right.
You know, and the hospital has to grant you that. Because this is really, like you said, with childbirth, you remember it, the details of it years from now.
Yes.
You know, you'll be 90 years old, you'll still remember your childbirth.
That's right.
Forget everybody else. You remember that. So we all have the right to that. And I think sometimes we get, like you said, the system, and we don't feel like we have choices. So it's just so important. So, and another question, and this person said that there was a doula that says she didn't have any losses, but it was a nurse midwife who said she never lost a patient in like 26 years.
Yes.
Or 20 years. I know it was a while. So, but she did ask, do you think doulas would be one way to help with this issue? And so, and I think we answered that. And I just want to say the midwife said something very important. She said, we care for the whole woman. And that's the key, is having someone that cares for you, not just listening to the heart rate, not just checking your blood pressure, but realize that you're a human. There's a human in this, two humans. But I think that's really the key in making sure that women have access to that, not just access to care, but access to quality care.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that, you're a CNM. I mean, I just want to ask you all the questions. And I'm also not trying to start the debate between like going to the hospital or having the midwife.
Right.
I don't want to, because at the end of the day, it's a birthing person's choice what they want, right? But at the same time, I'm doing some research right now where I've been interviewing Black birth workers about kind of what it's been like supporting Black birthing folk via COVID, and also in light of kind of the racial tensions that are like happening in the US. And I'm really interested to see, given the growing awareness about the issue and kind of, what's happening in our country right now, the kind of long-term shifts that might be happening for Black birthing folk. Because what I've heard is that, they're scared to go to the hospital. They're scared to die in a hospital. And so, Black birthing folk are seeking out doulas. They're seeking out midwives. They want a different type of care that's more holistic, that includes their family, that, so I think that, specifically in this case for Black birthing folk, I think people are asking these questions, like, what do I really want in my care? And, how does a doula kind of address my fears? Do they support me the way that I want? Is midwifery an alternative option? And so, I think there's something about really looking at the model of care and what that offers, the specifics of it, and what that offers Black birthing folk, And I know like folks are really familiar with Jenny Joseph and her work in Florida. And, I think she argues that like she kind of lays out the tenets of her model, which has been really effective for lowering disparities. And she's like, but you don't have to be a midwife at a birth center doing this. You can implement this way of caring for a birthing person into your clinic and into your hospital, so it's really kind of understanding what the care should look like, so that was a long answer, but yeah, like, what is it about doula care that makes it, what is it about that social support that actually has an impact on a person's outcome? I think those are the types of questions that need to be answered.
Yeah. Let me just add to that. I think you're right on point. Looking historically, Black nurse midwives, Black nurses was born out of the fact of when women were giving birth or had difficult births. This is where we as Black women came into play in providing care for women who were giving birth or for infants that were being born. So, and this, where was it done? In their home. And then there was this great decision to bring a woman to a facility, and I'm not knocking it, I'm just calling it what it is, bring it to a facility and have it associated with a, at that time, male physician, so that they can get the better care, and also get you in, get you out, charge you for what you use during that time. So there's something to look at what worked and can be approved upon with what took place by default, right? In terms of historical times, that we as Black women were very much nurse midwives and nurses upon call when needed on the plantations, as well as if the plantation didn't have it, they went and got Mama Sue down the road, sent a child to run down there to get Mama Sue, who was going to come back and deliver that child and take care of that mom and that baby. So something to be said that, again, we can look at that and bring it forward and support it. It doesn't have to be, like you said, I lay in that setting. And I give all kudos to Dr. Canty for the work that she's done. I mean, it's a beautiful thing. You know, it's all different models out there. And I think we need to look at that and embrace it.
Do you mind if I say one more really quick thing?
Sure, go right ahead.
Because I'm obsessed with like the granny midwives. But the other thing that I really love about the legacies of the granny midwives is they didn't just catch babies, right? They were like community workers, right?
Yes. Yes.
Supporting a family. It wasn't just about delivering the baby. Like they were supporting that whole family.
Yes.
There was a community aspect that I think the kind of current draw towards kind of doula programs and midwives, I think there's a piece of that happening too, and we're talking about racism and stress and feeling unsafe in your community or whatever, when you think about kind of what community offers in terms of how we become well, I think that there's something about the legacies of the granny midwife that speak to that and maybe what people are looking for.
Yes, but that's the key. Both of you are hitting on it. And Renee, like you're that historical perspective. When we were in the home and we just had that midwife, she didn't have a PhD, she didn't have all these degrees, but she was taking care of those women at a time where there was segregation. You couldn't go to the hospital if there was a complication.
That's right.
So they found a way. But when there was a shift, if you look at the history, things went downhill for us after we entered the hospital. The hospital looked at this place that was going to save you and give you a beautiful experience, but that wasn't true. It was like downhill from there. And looking at our numbers now is really showing that.
Yes.
Unfortunately.
Absolutely.
Yes. And so there's quite a few questions. I'm not sure if I'm going to get to all the questions, but there's a few I think that we kind of touched on. I think we have a little time, but we talked about some models of care. There was another question about, can you share any personal experiences where other colleagues or coworkers of color have supported you in this public health crisis? And they just say thank you for us, and they just want us to share. I think we kind of touched on it a little bit, but.
Well, one of the things I can bring up is that when I was the Commissioner for Public Health, as I indicated early on in the conversation, the presentation, is that I was able to have its first ever, right, maternal health summit dealing with Black maternal health as a health disparity. And at that time, I had Governor Lamont, I had also the Surgeon General for that time come and really talk about this issue so that we could kind of kick off, which we did. We kicked off having a gold ribbon commission to address maternal mortality. Believe it or not, you can believe it, it was in March, and literally right after that kickoff occurred, we had over 200 participants. We went right into COVID. And that's when it just, it changed everything for everyone. So there are a number of individuals that are committed to this and work on this that they were signed up to be a part of the commission to address this issue, along with working with the legislators and the legislative piece of the doulas and certification. So there is an entity, a group of individuals in Connecticut that not per se are truly community-based, which I think is a key piece that's lacking in Connecticut, but they do exist and they're very knowledgeable and open and wanting to work to address this issue.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I'm just looking at the comments too, where people are talking about, like, it sounds like there's some serious systems issues of, the patient needing care, but then the resident doctors kind of being a barrier to the person getting that care. And so that's a very serious, issue. And as we talk about healthcare providers, there's that we don't have any accountability in our state. You know, so what happens if a woman is mistreated? Like we hear about the maternal deaths, but we know for every maternal death, there's at least 100 women who come close to dying.
Yes.
So, and
Yes.
some horrible experiences. So
Absolutely.
how do we hold, you know, how do we hold people accountable, especially these big systems like these hospitals? Like, what can we do to address that?
Well, there's some ideas. I mean, here in Connecticut, you know, there's the Connecticut Hospital Association. There's the Maternal Mortality Review Committee, which really, again, I'm just going to state the fact that they're addressing it and they're looking at it. They have a ways to go, but there's an opportunity. There's their report that they've put out. The 3 slides that I presented on Connect came straight from their report. It's on the website for the Department of Public Health, but it also gives you some of the key players. You know, so this is an opportunity to have conversations with them. What are you doing, and how can we improve this, and really act on it? Not just collect the data and just report it out, but what are we doing to make change, positive change, to impact, so that maybe in a couple of, a year or 2, we can start to see those statistics go back to what, and I even hate to say this, to normalcy, whatever that may be. It should be 0, right? But that's the goal that you always shoot for. But the ultimate goal is to really look at what's already being done and build upon it, and talk to your legislators. They really do want to make a difference. Your Health and Human Committee at the legislature, the Public Health Committee, they make a difference in having the voice, the policy to put in play, and also allocating the money to do it. But it has to be that accountability. It really does have to be that. And like ILA, I love the fact that she came and talked about really what was going on at the community level. That's the piece. Again, I was with the department for 20-something years, that really needs to hone in on what's being done. And I got a chance to see what wasn't being done around the state. So community-based organizations that are positioned perfectly to make a difference is key in addressing this.
Yes, and someone was saying how they're on a constant basis fighting for this population. Is very stressful to not be heard. But we got to take action. Maybe we could find a way to support each other to address these issues, because it's stressful to try to do it on your own.
Yes.
This is something that we have to do together.
Absolutely. And I was like, I'm so excited because, I'm new to the area, and I'm like, some energy right here on this panel that is just, great.
Yeah.
And I think about what you're saying, Renee, about community. I think about back home. I mean, there's power in not to be cliche, but there's power in the people. There's power in the community, So, in holding folks accountable, there's something about having a group that can say, hey, guess what? We know this is happening and we're not okay with it,
Right.
And I know, like back home, there was a whole campaign within the city, and we organized and, got our hands on some data and things like that. And we're able to push the public health department to allocate money for health equity. And that went to community-based organizations. And that came from community. That pressure came.
Perfect. Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? So there are ways, that it can be done. So there's definitely like the internal kind of systems work, but then there's the community pressure, that's really powerful, I think as well. So it's community organizing, really.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes. In the chats, there's several people who are like giving us information, giving us their email that they want to share. And I know that we'll have information passed on to us.
Yes.
But it's getting close to 3:30. So I just want to thank the both of you. This has been very informative, and just really breaking down what's going on. Yeah. But I just want to know if you have any final words, anything that you want to make sure that everyone leaves with. Haley?
I think, okay, Haley.
Okay.
I'll go second.
Thank you. I just really want to end with it being known. I used to teach maternal and child health at UConn's public health program. And one of the biggest things is that I'll say again is that maternal health, infant mortality are true health indicators of how a community is doing or not doing as well, or a town or a city or a state or a country. And right now, we are in dire need, the African American community in the United States, in regards to this, because it's not just the infant mortality, the maternal mortality, but it's also the maternal morbidity and what's taken place. And until we, as a country, and I think we're slowly getting there, acknowledge the structural racism that exists and take the time to pull it apart and hit this particular issue that is the core for which this country was founded, I don't think we're going to make any major inroads, because this is one piece of the bigger picture of the overall health of our African American community in the United States. So we have to acknowledge it, good, bad, or indifferent, acknowledge it, address it in a I keep saying multi-pronged approach. And I think then that's when we'll start to see, and it's just starting. But my biggest fear, what I've seen through my 3 decades of public health, is that you'll get people to speak, and then there's some things will be done, and there just seems to be so much that it gets forgotten. Well, we can't forget this, because this again is an indicator of how poorly our African American community is doing in the United States. But again, this is why we have these forums, and I've been absolutely delighted to speak about this. This is one of my areas of passion, and I like working with the two of you. And it sounds like there is some momentum that is occurring.
Definitely. I don't have nothing else to say. That was it.
Oh my gosh!
On the head. So I'm just honored to be here. I think you wrapped that up perfectly.
Yes, that was beautiful. That was beautiful. And I appreciate the both of you. This is so informative. And this also lets us know that we have to keep moving. Like you said, we can't stop. We have to keep moving and address this issue. Okay. So to our attendees, thank you so much for spending this afternoon with us. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions. We will still take a look at things and see, how we can kind of get some of this information to you. But I appreciate your time and just want to thank UConn. I want to thank everyone for their support in this event. Okay, and thank you all as well. Thank you.
Thank you.